Let's go. Jane Eyre, one of the best books of the entire year we've ever read of all time. For Unit 12 billion of Briterature, I decided I would not only read the book, but I would submit myself to the worst kind of Roman torture you've ever heard of. Watching the movie. Except I didn't even watch the good movie. I watched the 1997 one, directed by a guy you've never even heard of before, funded by the English government, with a cast of people who I don't even think would have made the ensemble of Star Wars. That being said, though, they did a pretty good job, and it was pretty entertaining. So, do you know what? Let's just dive right into it. This one is a 1997 filming of Jane Eyre, directed by Robert Young, who's most known for one of his most favorite movies, Vampire Circus. Very famous movie. I'm sure it hit the box office at some point in time. Romance with a Double Bass, also a banger. And my personal favorite, Blood Monkey. Sounds like an absolute banger. So, with that being said, you must be like Keenan. There must be a great cast of people going along with this world-class director, and there are. There's Samantha Morton, who is one of the best actresses nominated for having 90% less hair than she did in the 90s. We have Kiran. I don't know how to say his name. It's probably a color of the alphabet. This dude looks like the kind of guy who would sell me expired lottery tickets outside my preschool. And then, best yet, we got Gemma Jones, who honestly looks like somebody's grandma who took the wrong turn to bingo night, accidentally auditioned for the movie, and made the cut. So that's sick. I am already in love with this movie, and we haven't even talked about it yet. We haven't even talked about how similar it is to the book. We haven't even talked about how great it is. So let's do that right now. All right, let's talk about the differences between this movie and the book. All right? Let's do it. So, the movie starts unlike the book where she's being dragged up into a room immediately. And I think this scene really does a good job of like placing her aunt's position in the book. It shows how awful she is, how much she hates Jane, and it makes it even worse because it seems like it's for no reason. In the book, we know that it's because she, beat the crap out of her cousin, even though he deserved it. But, without that context, it just seems like she's really cruel. And I think that's what they're really going for, is that her aunt's a terrible person. From there, they have the scene of her seeing ghosts in her late uncle's room, who was the only person in that family who appeared to like her at all, which is a good scene. And then she falls asleep underneath the bed because she's scared. She's hiding under the bed. Then the next morning, Bessie wakes her up and says, "Guess what? It's time for your interview." They jump right into the interview with Mr. Brocklehurst. There's no, getting to know Bessie a little better, getting to know her aunt a little better. Goes straight into that scene. So here we get to meet Mr. Brocklehurst, who's just kind of like an awful, cold man. Just somebody with no feelings, no care in the world for anybody. And her aunt kind of talks her, into being kind-ish a little bit for it, but she kind of digs at her niece, quote unquote, telling Mr. Brocklehurst she's an awful person. And Mr. Brocklehurst understands and agrees because she doesn't read enough of the Bible. Anyway, from there, she goes straight from that scene to being accepted to Lowood, which is kind of where the second part of the movie starts. So, from Lowood to her next time at, her first time at Thornfield, she really doesn't go through a lot of character development, like, mentally, that you, like, understand. She physically grows. They have a montage of her getting there with, like, Jane, older Jane, who voices over some parts of the movie, like future Jane when she's already married to Mr. Rochester. There's a voiceover, that's the first one in the movie, where she talks about getting there, how terrible it is, how terrible the food is, how terrible the water is. and just how awful the school is. But she likes two things about it. She likes the teachers. Some of the teachers are bearable, and she likes Helen, which is kind of where we meet Helen. And honestly, that scene where she's introduced is pretty much the only time they really talk about her. From there, the voiceover and like the montage ends, and we go into the classroom scene where she drops the slate. No scene meeting Miss Brocklehurst's family, and like the hypocrisy of him telling people not to wear furs because his family does it. We don't get any of that. We just get to see him as a cold, awful person. So, from there, she drops her slate. He makes her stand on the stool. And then we have another montage that brings us through pretty much the rest of the time before the typhus fever hits. You see kind of in the movie how Helen's the only one who cares for her and stays close with her, because she kind of walks up to her on the stool while there's a cutscene and music, and they kind of have like this bonding friendship moment. And then it cuts where it's spinning around the stool. It cuts into her leaning against the wall outside with coffins around her. And from that scene, she goes in to see Helen, who's incredibly sick and is going to die, very obviously. But she's hopeful about it, and she spends time with Helen and holds her hand. And then obviously they have their bonding moment. And she gets in bed with her, for their lovey friendship thing. And then she falls asleep. And the next scene is her being carried out of the room. And when she begs to go back, she's told that Helen's dead. And quite honestly, that's the end of Lowood. That's all you get. There's a montage-ish thing of her, growing up, voiced over by future Jane Eyre. That just kind of shows how she grew up, became older, started teaching there, how it got better as Mr. Brocklehurst was pushed out. And then future Jane talks about how she put a ad in the mail, or like the daily paper, for, a governess, and she got one reply. And then it cuts to her pulling up at Thornfield. So, Thornfield, let's talk about that. The best way to describe, her beginning time at Thornfield is like a donut. Quite honestly, everybody loves donuts. I've never met somebody who doesn't like donuts. I like donuts, and I can't even have regular donuts. So, it's just nice, She gets there, she's introduced nicely, everybody there loves her, and it really just makes it feel like a comfy, cozy spot, Honestly, the actors do a great job of playing their parts. They really seem to love it, and it just makes everyone in the entire scene feel super comfortable. And then they do something which is weird. They introduce, the monster in the closet early. They get this scene of, witch like laughing, and then people running up and down the hallway, and Jane turns, and every time she turns, there's nobody there. And she hears a slamming of the door as she runs down to that hallway where there was the running. And then, Miss Fairfax comes and says, like, oh, nothing to be worried about. No big deal. You're fine. Don't worry about it. It's okay. And, like, super sketchy, right? That's kind of the whole idea of it. So, from there, the story just kind of progresses, and there's a voiceover-ish kind of section where she gets to know Adele more, and future Jane Eyre voices over saying how she starts to get bored of being there. Not because it's a bad place, because she's restless. And obviously that's pretty much depicted in the book. As you read, you find out she's kind of a restless soul, never really satisfied, always looking for the next thing, which I think is one of the grounding, like, earthly parts about her character. Then she meets Mr. Rochester, and that's where the book really starts to get good. She meets Mr. Rochester on the scene where he rides in with his horse. They change a couple things. Instead of ice, he falls on water. The entire scene is pretty much like the book, honestly. And once she gets back to Thornfield after, meeting the mysterious man on the horse, she finds out it's Mr. Rochester, and she's like, oh my goodness, I didn't know, that's crazy. And she meets him in the drawing room, and you can immediately kind of tell there's like a something between them. There's like some kind of chemistry, but you can't really tell if it's love or hate. I wrote in my script that it's a love kind of like bond. But if you watch the movie, honestly, you can't really tell. If you haven't read the book before, you wouldn't know, because sometimes it seems like they're in love with each other, sometimes it doesn't. And as the movie keeps progressing, they have another scene where they meet in the drawing room and talk, and that's the scene that leads into Mr. Rochester leaving.
Not quite. So, one thing I missed in this, or two things I missed, is that there was a little scene of them walking through the garden with Adele, and he was talking kind of about his past, which I think is also in the book, if I remember correctly. But I also completely missed one of the best scenes in the book, which is obviously the scene where his bed gets set on fire. Uh, I'm just gonna throw some footage up from the movie and tell you it's pretty much the same as it was in the book, except that he stamps out the fire after she wakes him up with the bucket of water instead of her like putting out the fire with the water. So it's kind of like, since he's a man, he saves himself, but he understands that she saved him and all that. So yeah, that's basically that part of the thing.
To Mr. Rochester leaving, and Jane's super distressed about that. And she thinks about how much she's going to miss him as he's gone. And then one day she wakes up and she sees all the maids and everybody getting ready for like what seems like royalty to come into town. And she's like, "What's going on? Mr. Rochester's coming back with guests. Oh my goodness, that's crazy." So she's super excited about that. But this is when she gets introduced to the character, or idea at least, of Blanche. Is that how you say it? Blanche. 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 Blanche Ingram, who's kind of her competition. Not really, because they're completely different people. But yeah, that's when she starts thinking about this woman. And as Miss Fairfax keeps describing her as like this beautiful lady and everything, as she walks in the door, they kind of have the scene where all the royalty walks in the door with Mr. Rochester, and there's Blanche, and she's like, "Oh my goodness, I have no chance. I'm totally outdone by her. She's too beautiful." And from there, the scene just keeps progressing. Mr. Rochester seems to like her more as they spend more time together, like Blanche and Mr. Rochester. And Jane starts to get really, really jealous. And from there, Mr. Mason shows up, and it turns into turmoil. You know, the party ends, they go upstairs, he gets his room, and that's where the scene ends. But, like I said, turmoil. Mr. Rochester comes bashing through her door at like 2 in the morning and is like, "Hey, what's your opinion on blood?" And she's like, and he says, "Follow me." They go upstairs, and then there's Mr. Mason, laid out, hecking, bleeding his heart out from his shoulder because somebody's like bit him. There's no knife in the movie, it's just they bit him. And then Mr. Rochester takes off to get bandages. And then something happens again that doesn't happen in the book. They keep like sneaking it in there, the monster in the closet, Bertha, that we don't know yet. She shows up. The door's closed. Jane senses something isn't right, and she backs up behind the door, and the door opens. And in comes this huge monstrous woman who's like growling-ish. And then she grabs Mr. Mason's neck and leaves. And then Mr. Rochester comes back with the bandages. She's like, "Who the heck was that?" Bertha's terrifying, because... No, not Bertha. Grace. She thinks Grace is terrifying throughout the whole thing. And she says, she's terrible, you need to get rid of her. So, yeah. From there, they kind of turn in the next scene of Mr. Mason being shipped off in an ambulance-type hospital cart thing. And then they have this scene where they go on the hill, which kind of replaces a scene in the book of him explaining everything to her. They go onto this hill, which is nice and scenic, and they have this conversation. And Mr. Rochester asks, most importantly, what would you do if you did something unforgivable? She said, "I'd ask for God's forgiveness." He hates that answer. They talk about his soon coming wedding. She doesn't understand that he wants her. That super exciting. So, from there, things keep going on. Keeps becoming better and better friends with him. And then she asks for leave to go to her aunt's because her aunt is dying. This is the scene where, Bessie comes. It actually happens where they come off the hill and Bessie is waiting for her in a room. Miss Fairfax says, "Yo, there's someone waiting for you." She goes into the room. Oh my goodness, it's Bessie. She says straight up, your cousin John died. Like, he seriously just died. That's all she says. And your aunt is in poor health. So from there, she goes back to see her aunt. In that scene, there's nothing because they skipped it. They skipped the entire thing. Literally, she goes out on a carriage. The scene goes black. The same freaking carriage comes back. The entire, like, it's the same everything. She's wearing the same thing. She comes back. So they skipped that scene, which is kind of an important character development moment for everybody involved. But we won't worry about it. It's fine. It's fine. It's no big deal. It's not like it's, you know, one of my favorite scenes in the book because it's super funny how uncomfortable they all are. No biggie. Anyway, he comes back, and this is the scene where they confess their love. He tells her that he's found a post for her. Unlike in the book where she says she's going to list, he says he'll find a post for her. You're going to go to Ireland. She breaks down. She's like,
I don't want to leave. I love you too much. And then he says,
I love you too, baby.
And they, go like, we're going to be married now. And from there, they go into town. They see Blanche. He says, haha, look at my wife. You're not my wife. Lol, get wrecked. And all that exciting stuff. So, yeah. Kind of sick, I guess. I don't know. And that's when things start to get worse. That night, when she comes home from dress shopping, she has the dream. The dream of Bertha ripping her veil. And, Mr. Rochester has a slightly different scene from the book where he comes in, says, it's okay, don't worry about it. You were just having a bad dream. Here's a funny snow globe that makes noises we can dance to. And then they dance. And that's it. From there, we get the next scene, which is the church scene. Then there's the church scene. And now the church scene is completely different from the book, okay? It's like totally different. There's no gravestone, people in the yard, weird people thing. They go straight into her, they say their vows and everything. They're doing their marriage thing. They're literally on there. The preachers, they're literally on the stage. Everybody's watching. Mr. Preacher Man is there. He's about to wed them. And then there's this, flip back and forth between this scene and someone riding a horse really fast. And then you find out, as the church comes into sight, this horse is riding towards the church. And obviously the man who dismounts as they get to the church just in time is Mr. Mason. He has the legal documents of Mr. Rochester already being married, and that's where everything falls down. Mr. Rochester gets super mad, grabs Jane, takes her back to the house, and they reveal Bertha. So, they reveal Bertha. Jane gets her stuff, takes off. Mr. Rochester has a little talk with her. She's unswayed. She's out. Bro, she's dipping. Straight up. This chick, within 5 minutes of seeing Bertha, she has her stuff together. She's in a carriage. She's gone. She doesn't even know where she's going. She has $5 to her name. Literally almost $5 to her name. She travels 100 miles, gets dumped from the carriage. She's walking. She's walking through a field. And she passes out. And that's kind of the end of Thornfield for now. So, as it turns out, I'm way over length on this, so I really need to shorten it out. I'm just going to say, compared to the book, this last part of, her at her cousin's house is pretty different. It's basically just a montage, voiceover. She gets proposed to because, what's-her-name cousin thinks she should learn Hindi instead of German, and says, you be my wife, come with me, and she says no. She hears Mr. Rochester's voice, and she knows immediately where she has to go. Back to Thornfield. The scene ends. She travels again back to Thornfield. And this is where it gets good. This is where the movie comes to a head. Literally at this point, they spent an hour and 10 minutes out of this hour 45-minute movie talking about her at Thornfield. There's 20 minutes of this movie left when There's 20 minutes of this movie left when she gets to her cousin's house. I'm dead serious. They take so little time at her cousin's house. It's so fast. And that's another thing of like character development I struggle with is she didn't get any character development there. She's missing out on all that. You know, like it's different from the book. Anyway, she goes back to Thornfield, finds out it's burnt down, and instead of going to the inn, she goes to see the pastor who's officiating their wedding, and he says, "Yeah, house burnt down. Bertha died, so that's sick, and he's blind, and he lives in a cabin in the woods." And from there, basically, the movie wraps. She goes to see him. They have this loving scene where they come back together. She surprises him with her presence, with her voice, and he starts crying and says, "How do I know you? How do I know you're not just being, it's not just a mercy, Mary. You actually love me." And she said, "Because I've always loved you." Basically, it's like something like that. It's ridiculous. And then they get together, they get married, and then the next scene is them with kids by a pond getting married. And that's kind of like after, he finds out that she does still love him. The rest of the movie is just voiceover of future Jane, or I guess present Jane, since, we're at the end of the movie, talking about how they got married, had kids, how he, got his vision back, and that's it. So, there you go. As you could see, the movie wasn't bad, actually. There was some turns in it, there were some twists, there were some things they changed, but they really took, like, the whole tree. Take this for, like, an imagery in your brain. They took the entire tree of the movie, right? And then they said, what do we need? And they cut it down to, like, a trunk with some limbs on it. And they added their own little touches where they needed. And honestly, it wasn't bad. I think they kind of missed three things. They really missed out on Lowood. There was a lot that went on there. Her kind of developing into an older person. Really misses that in the book. Most of the time is spent at her being in, like, her 20s. Like, late teens, early 20s at Thornfield. She misses the development with her aunt a lot, I think. That was an important part. And then, of course, the time with her, cousins, or quote-unquote cousins, or whatever. Long-lost family, realizing who she is, who she wants to be, where she wants to go. Other than that, not bad. Honestly, I think they kind of cut out a lot of unnecessary detail, which was good. And honestly, it was not terrible. So, yeah. There you go. Thanks for watching. Hope this is fun and new and exciting, and you enjoy it. And yeah, I guess I'll see you later.